Commander Vrath of the Calithian Empire moved through the archive of locks like he owned the place, which in a way he did. His crystalline armor caught the light from above, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the ancient stone walls. Behind him, walking at a casual pace that seemed to annoy the commander, was Derek Hayes, human diplomat and apparently the galaxy's newest source of entertainment. They had been walking for over an hour now. Derek had lost count of how many chambers they had passed through, each one filled with locks, vaults, and security systems that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. Except this was real, and these devices had stumped entire civilizations. "You grow tired?" Vrath asked without turning around, his voice carrying that edge of superiority Derek had grown used to over the past week. "Just enjoying the scenery," Derek replied, which was partially true. The archive was beautiful in a cold, intimidating way. Like a museum designed by someone who wanted visitors to feel small. Vrath finally stopped in front of a massive doorway. No, not a doorway. Derek corrected himself as they stepped through. This was the entrance to something bigger. The chamber beyond was circular, with a domed ceiling that must have been 100 feet high. And in the center, sitting on a raised platform, was a structure that made Derek's breath catch in his throat. It was a vault, but calling it just a vault felt wrong. The thing was enormous, maybe 20 feet tall and just as wide. Its surface was pure black, the kind of black that seemed to pull light into it rather than reflect it. Every inch was covered in carvings, patterns that swirled and twisted in ways that hurt to look at for too long. "This," Vrath announced, spreading his forearms wide in a gesture Derek assumed was meant to be dramatic, "is the Vault of Eternal Silence." Derek walked closer, his footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. Two Calithian officers stood near the vault, and both turned to look at him. One made a clicking sound with its mandibles, and the other responded with what Derek was pretty sure was a laugh. 10,000 years, Vrath continued, walking around the vault like a teacher giving a lecture. "Do you understand what that means, human? Your species was barely out of caves when this vault was already ancient. Every major civilization in the galaxy has attempted to open it. The Mordathi brought quantum decryptors that could crack a neutron star. The Selling used molecular manipulators that could phase through solid matter. The Thex even tried to move it into a pocket dimension to study it." "Let me guess," Derek said, running his eyes over the carved patterns. "Nobody succeeded." "Correct." Vrath moved to stand directly in front of the vault, his back to Derek. "Inside this vault is knowledge from the ancients. A civilization so advanced that our current technology would seem like children playing with sticks to them. Medical breakthroughs that could end disease. Energy sources that could power entire star systems. Weapons that could." He trailed off, but Derek caught the implication. One of the officers spoke in Calithian, and though Derek's translator chip could have given him the words, he had turned it off after the first day when he realized they were mostly making jokes about humans. The universal translator in his ear only worked when someone spoke directly to him. "Your species has been spacefaring for what, 200 years? Vrath turned to face Derek, and his expression was hard to read on his alien features, but Derek was getting better at it. That was definitely condescension. "You should not feel inadequate standing before this challenge. Species with millions of years of advancement have stood where you stand now and failed." Derek wanted to point out that he had not asked to be brought here, that this felt more like Vrath showing off than any genuine diplomatic exchange. But he kept quiet and moved closer to the vault instead. "The surface is protected," one of the officers said in heavily accented English. "Touch causes pain. Not harm, but very uncomfortable." Derek nodded his thanks and reached out slowly. His palm hovered an inch from the black surface, and he could feel something, a kind of vibration in the air that made his teeth ache. Then he pressed his hand flat against the vault. It felt cold, smooth, and somehow, impossibly, it felt alive. Like touching the skin of some massive sleeping creature. Derek waited for the promised pain, but nothing happened. Just that cold, smooth surface and the sensation of something vast and patient waiting on the other side. Behind him, he heard one of the officers shuffle nervously. Vratha's armor plates shifted, which Derek had learned meant the commander was either annoyed or surprised. "Interesting," Derek murmured, keeping his hand on the vault. Through his palm he could feel something like a heartbeat, slow and steady. This was not just a lock. This was something else entirely. And suddenly, standing in this ancient chamber surrounded by aliens who expected him to fail, Derek felt the first stirring of an idea. Retry. Derek spent the next 20 minutes doing something that clearly frustrated Commander Vrath to no end. He walked, slowly, around the entire vault, stopping every few feet to examine different sections of the carved surface. Sometimes he would crouch down low, tilting his head to see the patterns from a different angle. Other times he would stand on his toes, stretching to trace his fingers along grooves that were just out of comfortable reach. The Calithian officers watched him with barely concealed amusement. One of them kept checking a device on his wrist, probably timing how long this human would waste their time before admitting defeat. Vratha's patience finally broke when Derek knelt down for the third time to examine the base where the vault met the floor. The vault, Vrath said, his voice tight with controlled irritation, is composed of exotic matter. Do you understand what that means? Not really, Derek admitted, not looking up from where he was studying a particular pattern that seemed to repeat itself. It means the material exists partially outside normal space. The locking mechanism operates across 11 dimensions simultaneously. We have used harmonic resonance technology that can shatter moons. We have deployed temporal displacement fields that can age objects forward or backward in time. We even attempted to phase through it using dark matter channeling, a process that requires the energy output of a small sun. Derek stood up and moved to another section of the vault. Wow, that sounds complicated. One of the officers said something in Calithian that made the other one laugh. Vrath responded sharply, silencing them both. The technology required just to properly scan this vault, Vrath continued, his tone that of someone explaining basic math to a child who kept getting it wrong, is beyond anything your species currently possesses. Your most advanced computers could not begin to map the quantum states involved. Your scientists would need another 1,000 years just to understand the principles at work here. Probably, Derek agreed. He had made his way back to the front of the vault and stood there, arms crossed, just looking at it. Really looking at it like he was trying to see beyond the surface. Then what exactly are you doing? Vrath demanded. Thinking. Derek tilted his head. Tell me about the people who built this. The question seemed to catch Vrath off guard. His mandibles clicked in confusion. The ancients? They vanished millennia ago. The historical record is incomplete. But you must know something, Derek pressed. What kind of civilization were they? What did they care about? What mattered to them? Vrath exchanged glances with his officers. That information is not relevant to the problem at hand. Isn't it? Derek walked closer to the vault again, his eyes following the flow of the carved patterns. These markings all over the surface. They're not just random security features, are they? Our analysis indicates they are integral to the quantum locking mechanism, one of the officers said, pulling up a holographic display from his wrist device. The patterns shift on a subatomic level, creating an encryption matrix that changes based on the observer's position in spacetime relative to. Yeah, but what do they show? Derek interrupted. Forget the quantum stuff for a second. Just look at them. What do you see? The officer's holographic display flickered and died. He stared at Derek like the human had just asked him to describe the color of mathematics. Vrath moved closer to the vault, and for the first time since they had entered the chamber, he seemed to actually look at the carvings rather than through them. They appear to be figures. Beings of some kind in various poses. Right? Derek said, warming to his point. And what are those beings doing? Vrath studied the patterns more carefully. They are sitting. Or standing still. Some appear to be in groups, others alone. They are not fighting or building or working. They are simply. He trailed off, searching for the word. Waiting, Derek finished. They're waiting. They're peaceful. Look at this one here. He traced his finger along a relief that showed a clearly humanoid figure sitting with its legs crossed, hands resting on its knees. This is someone meditating. And here this group. They're gathered together but not doing anything. Just being present with each other. One of the officers scoffed. What does ancient art have to do with breaking a quantum lock? Derek turned to face them all. What if it has everything to do with it? You've been treating this like a puzzle to solve or an enemy to defeat. But what if the people who built this thought completely differently than you do? Meaning? Vratha's tone was skeptical, but there was a hint of curiosity there too. Meaning maybe they didn't think of this as a lock at all. Derek looked back at the vault. Every figure carved into this thing is shown in a state of calm, of patience, of peaceful waiting. There's not a single image of violence or force or struggle. Doesn't that tell you something about the people who made it? It tells me they were impractical, Vrath said. The galaxy is not a peaceful place. It never has been. Maybe that's exactly why they disappeared, Derek said quietly. Or maybe they're gone because they chose to leave. But either way they left this behind. And they covered it with images of patience and peace. He walked around the vault one more time, slower now, his hand trailing along the surface. You've been trying to break into this for 300 years using force and technology. What if that's exactly the wrong approach? What if the ancients built this specifically to keep out anyone who came at it with aggression or impatience? The chamber fell silent except for the faint hum of the Calithians' equipment. Vrath stared at the vault like he was seeing it for the first time. That's absurd, the commander finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. A lock that opens based on the emotional state of whoever approaches it? That's not science, that's mysticism. Is it? Derek smiled slightly. You said yourself that you don't fully understand the principles at work here. Your technology is advanced, but theirs was more advanced. Maybe they figured out how to build something that responds not just to codes or keys, but to intent, to approach, to the kind of person standing in front of it. He stepped back from the vault and looked at Vrath directly. You want to know what I'm doing? I'm trying to understand what they were asking for. Because I don't think this is locked. I think it's just waiting for someone to ask permission instead of demanding entry. Retry. Derek did something that made the Calithians visibly uncomfortable. He walked away from the vault, found a clear spot on the floor about 10 feet in front of it and sat down. Just sat down cross-legged on the cold stone floor like he was in a park somewhere back on Earth. What are you doing? Vratha's voice carried a sharp edge that Derek had not heard before. It was not quite anger, more like confusion mixed with frustration and maybe a hint of concern that the human had lost his mind. Sitting, Derek replied simply. He closed his eyes and took a slow, deep breath. We can see that, one of the officers said. Why are you sitting? Thinking. Waiting. Being patient. Derek kept his eyes closed and his breathing steady. Vratha's armor plates shifted and clicked, the alien equivalent of someone tapping their foot impatiently. We have computational arrays that can process 1 billion scenarios per second. We have artificial intelligence systems that can... I don't need computers for this, Derek said calmly, not opening his eyes. The two officers looked at each other, and one of them said something in Calithian that made the other snort with laughter. Derek's translator chip picked up enough to know they were making jokes about primitive human meditation practices. Vrath responded sharply in Calithian, probably telling them to be quiet, but Derek could hear the doubt in the commander's voice too. They all thought he had given up in the weirdest possible way. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. Derek focused on his breathing, on the feeling of the cool air moving in and out of his lungs. He thought about the carvings on the vault, all those figures shown in states of peaceful waiting. He thought about what kind of people would choose to preserve their legacy behind something that required patience to access. At the 7-minute mark, he heard one of the officers walk away, probably to set up more scanning equipment. The sound of tools being unpacked echoed through the chamber. Your meditation will not open a quantum lock, Vrath said. His tone was gentler now, almost pitying. Like he was watching someone fail and felt bad about it. Derek opened his eyes but did not stand up. The people who built this vault valued patience. Every single figure carved into that surface is shown waiting. Being still. Thinking. They're not rushing, not forcing anything, not trying to break through obstacles with power. So... The officer who had stayed nearby sounded genuinely confused. So maybe that's the whole point. Derek looked up at the massive black vault in front of him. You've spent 3 centuries trying to crack this thing open. Throwing technology at it, using force, trying to hack through its defenses or phase around them or break through dimensions to get inside. Because that is how security works, Vrath said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Derek slowly got to his feet, brushing dust off his pants. That's how your security works. That's how human security works, mostly. But what if the ancients didn't think like us at all? He walked toward the vault, his movements deliberate and calm. What if they built this specifically to keep out anyone who approached it with aggression or force or impatience? What if they wanted to make sure that only a certain kind of person could access what's inside? What kind of person? Vrath asked. Someone who understands the value of waiting. Someone who approaches with respect instead of demands. Derek reached the vault and stood before it, studying the patterns one more time. His eyes traced the carved figures looking for something specific. There. Near the center, at about chest height, were 2 images that stood out from the rest. 2 figures, clearly meant to be a matched pair, each with their hands raised and pressed flat against the surface. The positioning was deliberate, precise. You've been treating this like an enemy fortress, Derek said quietly. Something to conquer or defeat. But look at these carvings. Really look at them. There's no violence here. No force. No breaking or shattering or destroying. He raised his own hands, positioning them carefully. There's only connection. Patience. The willingness to wait and show respect. He placed his palms flat against the vault's surface, matching the exact position shown in the carvings. The black material felt cool and smooth under his hands, that same sense of something alive and waiting that he had felt before. What if it was never locked at all? Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. What if it's just been waiting all this time for someone to approach it the right way? Not with quantum decryptors or temporal fields or dimensional phasing. Just with patience and respect and the simple act of asking permission. He stood there, palms pressed against the ancient surface, breathing slowly and evenly. Waiting. Not forcing. Not demanding. Just being present and patient and respectful of what had been left behind by a civilization that valued these things above all else. For 10 seconds nothing happened. Derek could feel Vrath and the officers staring at him. He could almost hear them thinking that this was it, the moment when the humans' crazy theory would fail and they could all go back to doing things the proper technological way. 15 seconds. 20. Derek focused on his breathing and on the feeling of that cool, smooth surface under his palms. He thought about the ancients, whoever they had been, and silently thanked them for creating something beautiful and mysterious. At 30 seconds something changed. It started as a vibration so faint that Derek almost thought he was imagining it. Then it grew stronger, a deep hum that came not from the air but from the vault itself. The sound was lower than hearing, felt in the chest and bones rather than perceived by the ears. Behind him, Derek heard Vrath take a sharp breath. The patterns carved into the vault's surface began to glow. It started at the points where Derek's hands touched and spread outward like water flowing across the black material. Gold light filled the carved channels, running along the paths of the patterns, illuminating figure after figure in soft, warm luminescence. The hum grew deeper, and Derek felt it resonate in his chest like the lowest note of a massive organ. The vault was not opening yet, but it was responding. After 10,000 years of silence, it was finally answering someone who had asked the right question in the right way. Impossible, Vrath whispered, but the word was lost in the sound of the vault coming to life. Derek kept his hands steady, kept his breathing calm and waited. The golden light spread across the entire surface now, every carved pattern glowing with that soft, warm radiance. And then, with a sound like a long-held breath finally being released, the vault began to open. The vault opened in a way that seemed almost organic, like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. The black obsidian walls separated into sections, each piece sliding away from the center with perfect precision. There was no grinding of gears or hiss of hydraulics. Just smooth, silent movement accompanied by that deep hum that Derek could feel in his bones. Golden light spilled out from inside, and with it came a scent that Derek had not expected. Old paper. Preserved flowers. Something that smelled like libraries back on Earth mixed with incense and age. It was the smell of things carefully kept and lovingly maintained across vast stretches of time. Derek stepped back as the vault fully opened, giving the interior space to reveal itself. Behind him, he heard one of the Calithian officers drop whatever tool he had been holding. It clattered on the stone floor, impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Vrath said nothing. For maybe the first time since Derek had met him, the commander was completely speechless. Inside the vault were shelves. Hundreds of them, stretching back into a space that seemed larger than should have been possible given the vault's external dimensions. And on those shelves were books. Actual, physical books bound in materials that had somehow survived 10,000 years without decay. The spines showed writing in a script Derek could not read, but the care taken in their creation was obvious even from a distance. Crystal cases lined the walls, each one containing scrolls arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of deep respect for what they held. Some were made of materials that looked like paper, others seemed to be metal or crystal themselves, but all were preserved perfectly. But it was not just books and scrolls. Paintings hung between the shelves, showing scenes of the ancients in daily life. They did look remarkably humanoid, Derek noticed. 2 arms, 2 legs, faces that expressed emotion in ways he could recognize even across the gulf of millennia. The paintings showed them teaching, creating art, celebrating together, sitting in contemplation. Musical instruments were displayed on stands, their designs alien but their purpose clear. One looked almost like a guitar, another reminded Derek of a harp, and several were completely unlike anything he had seen before but were clearly meant to create sound and beauty. In the center of the space, a holographic display flickered to life. It showed images of the ancients themselves, not in battle or conquest, but in moments that felt intimate and real. Parents with children. Teachers with students. Artists creating. People simply living and finding joy in existence. Derek took a careful step inside, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. The air itself felt different here, charged with something he could not name but recognized instinctively as important. "It's a library," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It felt wrong to speak loudly in this place. They locked away their culture. Vrath moved to the entrance but did not cross the threshold. His 4 arms hung at his sides, and his mandibles worked silently as he tried to process what he was seeing. Where are the weapons? The power generation specifications? The medical technologies that could cure any disease? Derek walked further into the vault, his eyes moving from shelf to shelf. He picked up one book carefully, cradling it like the precious artifact it was. The pages were covered in that same script he could not read, but illustrations showed figures engaged in philosophical discussions, hands moving in gestures of teaching and learning. "This is the treasure, Commander," Derek said, turning to look at Vrath. "Don't you see? They had all that other stuff. They had the weapons and the power sources and the medical tech. But that's not what they chose to preserve." One of the Calithian officers had recovered enough to activate his translation device. He pointed it at the holographic display, and text began scrolling across the air in multiple languages. The device cycled through Calithian first, then Standard Galactic, and finally settled on English. Derek read the words aloud as they appeared. "To those who find patience we offer understanding. To those who approach in peace we share our soul. Force will not breach these walls, for the strongest lock is opened by the gentlest key. The desire to understand rather than conquer, to learn rather than take, to preserve rather than exploit." The words continued scrolling. "We were once like you. We measured our worth in power and conquest. We built weapons that could shatter worlds and shields that could withstand any attack. But we learned, slowly and painfully, that true advancement is not measured in destructive capacity or technological superiority. It is measured in wisdom, compassion, and the courage to value life over power." Vrath finally stepped into the vault, moving like someone walking through a dream. He approached a shelf and stared at the books as if seeing them for the first time. 300 years, he said, his voice hollow. "My people have spent 300 years trying to break through quantum barriers and phase through dimensions. And all this time, it would have opened for anyone who approached it with respect and patience," Derek finished gently. He set the book back on its shelf with great care. "Your people aren't stupid, Commander. You're incredibly advanced. But maybe you were looking at the wrong kind of intelligence." Derek walked deeper into the library, running his fingers along the spines of books that contained the thoughts and dreams and accumulated wisdom of an entire civilization. Humans learned something over our history. We learned it the hard way, through wars and disasters and near self-destruction. Sometimes the hardest problems have the simplest solutions. Not because the solutions are easy, but because seeing simplicity requires a different kind of wisdom. He stopped in front of a painting that showed an ancient teacher surrounded by students of various ages. The teacher's hands were open, offering rather than taking. The students looked engaged, curious, respectful. "We got really good at building complicated weapons and defensive systems," Derek continued. "We got good at encryption and security and keeping people out. But we also learned that sometimes the best protection is not a bigger wall or a more complex lock. Sometimes the best protection is building something that only the right kind of person would even want to access." Vrath picked up a scroll from one of the crystal cases, handling it with a reverence that Derek had not seen from him before. "What have we been missing?" the commander asked, and the question seemed directed more at himself than at Derek. "In all our advancement, in all our technological superiority, what have we stopped seeing?" Derek smiled slightly. "That's exactly the right question. And maybe that's why the vault opened. Not because I did something clever or figured out some trick. But because we were finally ready to ask that question instead of demanding answers." The holographic display changed, showing new images. The ancients in their final days, carefully loading books onto shelves, preserving art, storing the essence of who they were. They looked peaceful, purposeful, like people who knew they were leaving something precious behind for whoever came after. "They trusted us," Derek said quietly. "All of us. Every species that would come later. They just wanted to make sure that whoever found this would be ready to appreciate it. Ready to learn from it instead of exploit it." 3 days after the vault opened, Derek found himself sitting in his temporary quarters on the Calithian homeworld, watching news reports from across the galaxy. Every channel was covering the same story, and every species had their own take on what had happened. Some of the reports made him sound like some kind of mystical figure who possessed ancient wisdom. Others suggested it was pure luck, right place and right time. A few of the more skeptical outlets were claiming the whole thing had been staged, that humanity had somehow known the secret all along. Derek found that last theory particularly amusing considering he had been just as surprised as everyone else when the vault actually opened. But the core truth was spreading and no amount of spin could change it. A human had opened what the galaxy's most advanced civilizations could not. And he had done it not with technology or force, but with patience and respect. A chime at his door interrupted his channel surfing. "Come in," he called, already knowing who it would be. Vrath entered, and Derek noticed immediately that something had changed about the commander. He moved differently now, less rigid, less like he was constantly proving something. His armor was the same, his forearms just as intimidating, but the attitude behind them had shifted. "The Council has reached a decision," Vrath said, standing in the center of the room rather than looming over Derek like he used to. "We would like to formally invite humanity to lead a new initiative across the galactic community." Derek muted the news broadcast and turned to face the commander fully. "What kind of initiative?" "A cultural exchange program." Vratha's mandibles moved in what Derek had learned was the Calithian equivalent of a self-deprecating smile. "Not technology sharing. Not military alliances. Culture. Philosophy. The things your species demonstrated we have been neglecting." "Not a technology exchange?" Derek raised an eyebrow. "That's surprising coming from the Calithian Empire." Vrath walked to the window that looked out over the capital city, all gleaming towers and advanced architecture that seemed to defy physics. "We have technology in abundance. Every species in the Council does. We can destroy planets or heal them. We can travel faster than light and communicate across the galaxy instantly. We have solved almost every technical problem imaginable." He turned back to face Derek. "But we have 17 active diplomatic conflicts in the Calithian Empire alone. Disputes that have lasted decades or even centuries. Trade disagreements that have nearly led to wars. Cultural misunderstandings that have cost lives. And now I am beginning to wonder if we have been approaching all of them the wrong way." Derek stood and walked over to stand beside Vrath at the window. "Commander, humans aren't special. We don't have some magical ability that other species lack. We're just younger. We haven't been in space as long as everyone else." "Perhaps that is exactly the point," Vrath said. "You see things from a different perspective because you have not learned to overcomplicate them yet. The vault proved that. While we were analyzing quantum states and dimensional matrices, you were looking at art and asking questions about the people who created it." Derek thought about that for a moment, watching ships take off and land at the spaceport in the distance. "Back on Earth we have this saying. When you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Maybe when you're the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy, every problem looks like it needs a technological solution. And when you are young enough to not yet have the biggest hammer," Vrath continued the thought, "you learn to use other tools. Communication. Understanding. Patience." Over the next 2 weeks, Derek worked with a joint team of humans and Calithians to begin properly studying the vault's contents. Translation technology was carefully applied to the ancient texts, and what they found was remarkable. The ancients had developed entire philosophical frameworks around balance between progress and wisdom, between individual achievement and community harmony, between the pursuit of knowledge and the responsibility that came with it. One text in particular struck Derek as profound. It described the moment when the ancient civilization had achieved what they called technological transcendence. They had solved every material problem, conquered every technical challenge, and stood at the peak of physical achievement. And in that moment of triumph, they had looked around and realized they had nearly lost themselves in the process. The text described their decision to step back, to deliberately slow their technological advancement and focus instead on cultural and philosophical growth. They spent their final centuries not building bigger weapons or faster ships, but creating art, developing ethical frameworks, and trying to understand what it meant to live a good life in a universe of infinite possibilities. They chose this, Derek told Vrath as they stood in the vault, now permanently open and being studied by scholars from a dozen species. They could have kept going, kept advancing technologically until they were basically gods. But they chose wisdom over power. The incident changed more than just academic interest in ancient civilizations. Within a month, Derek was invited to address the Galactic Council directly. He stood in a chamber designed to hold representatives from 40 different species, all of them more technologically advanced than humanity, and felt the weight of what he was about to say. "The Vault of Eternal Silence taught us something crucial," Derek began, his voice being translated into dozens of languages simultaneously. "The ancients were not testing our technology. They were testing whether we had evolved enough as beings to value understanding over conquest, to choose patience over force. To approach the unknown with respect rather than demands. He paused, looking out at the assembled representatives. Some looked engaged, others skeptical, but all of them were listening in a way that would not have happened a month ago. For 10,000 years the galaxy failed that test. Not because we were not smart enough or advanced enough, but because we were asking the wrong questions and measuring success by the wrong metrics. We thought strength meant bigger weapons and faster computers. We thought progress meant technological superiority. A representative from the Thex Collective, a species known for their quantum computing capabilities, spoke up. Are you suggesting we abandon technological advancement? No, Derek said firmly. I'm suggesting we balance it. The ancients did not reject technology. They mastered it. But then they chose to focus on something else because they recognized that all the technology in the universe means nothing if you don't have the wisdom to use it well. He walked to the center of the chamber where a holographic display showed the open vault. Humanity is not more advanced than any species here. We're newcomers. We're still figuring things out. But maybe that's exactly why we could open that vault. We have not yet learned to overcomplicate everything. We still remember that sometimes the answer is simple not because it is easy, but because simplicity requires its own kind of sophistication. The council session lasted 4 hours. By the end, they had approved funding for cultural exchange programs between humanity and 17 different species. Educational initiatives were proposed. Artistic collaborations were planned. And most significantly, a new position was created. Ambassador of Cultural Understanding, with Derek as the first to hold the title. 6 months later, Derek stood once again in the archive of locks, but this time he was not alone. A group of young beings from 8 different species stood with him, the first class of what was being called the Cultural Bridge Academy. They ranged from a Calithian barely into adulthood to a Mordathi child to 3 humans and representatives from species Derek was still learning about. Why are we starting here? One of the human students asked, a young woman named Taylor who had been studying xenoanthropology at university when she was selected for the program. Because this is where everything changed, Derek said, gesturing to the vault. Golden light still spilled from its open entrance, and the carved patterns on its surface served as a constant reminder. This vault stood locked for 10,000 years because everyone who approached it was trying to break in. They were trying to solve it like a puzzle or defeat it like an enemy. He led the students closer. But the ancients did not build a puzzle or an enemy. They built a gift. They just wanted to make sure that gift went to people who were ready to appreciate it. People who understood that the most valuable things in life cannot be taken by force. They can only be received with respect and patience. A young Calithian student, her armor still soft and pale with youth, touched the vault's surface gently. My grandfather served under Commander Vrath. He told me that before this opened, our people thought patience was weakness. That waiting meant losing. And now? Derek asked. Now we are learning that patience is its own kind of strength. Maybe the hardest kind. Derek smiled. That was exactly the lesson he hoped they would carry forward. Not just these students but entire civilizations learning to see strength in new ways. In the vault behind them, the words of the ancients glowed softly in the golden light. The gentlest key opens the strongest lock. It had become something of a motto for the new cultural initiatives spreading across the galaxy. A reminder that understanding could achieve what force could not. And carved into the floor of the archive, in languages from across the known galaxy including English, new words had been added to honor what happened here. Open not by force but by understanding. Not by technology but by wisdom. May all who enter remember that connection and respect unlock more doors than power ever will. Derek looked at his students, these young beings from so many different worlds, and felt hopeful about the future. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years trying to break down a door. Maybe now they could learn to knock instead.